I'm Heather Staines. I'm a senior strategy consultant for DeltaThink, and I also run the data and analytics tool. But I'm also here today with my STM Solutions hat on. Many of you know that since the fall of 2020, I've been working on the Get FTR and Seamless Access initiative. So I'm looking forward, if folks have questions about those, please do find me. We have a couple of different parts to our session today, but as Deborah mentioned, the first order of business is to reveal the trends infographic. And to do that, I will introduce my colleague, Hilke Koers. He is the Chief Information Officer for STM Solutions, and he's very excited about unveiling this for you today.
There we go. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Heather. So my name is Hilke Koers. I'm the CIO of STM Solutions, and I have the distinct pleasure to be here today and unveil officially this year's STM trends. Before I do so, though, let me start with a brief introduction for those of you that are not or less familiar with STM trends. It's essentially a forecasting exercise. We do this every year. We've done this for more than 10 years. We assemble a crowd of colleagues, very forward-looking strategic thinkers, to collectively look into our huge crystal orbs and discuss what the future will have in stock for our sector. This is not just free-form imagination. We do it in a structured way, and we use the Delphi method, which means that we ask people to prepare a list with 3 to 5 trends which they believe will be fundamental change drivers. We ask folks to share that. We go around the room twice. We have discussions at the table. Then we bring it all together in a group discussion. And after that, we try to translate all of those discussions and all of those fantastic ideas and perspectives into a visual. And the idea is the visual summarizes the discussion and provides pointers to the key trends that will shape how scholarly communications will look like in 5 years from now. This is not meant to be very quantitative. You won't see metrics or KPIs or any hard data, but calling attention to what we believe will be the key differences, the step changes in the future 5 years from now. So here you see a collection of some of the most recent trends visuals, and this has become a very rich tradition that I'm excited that we'll be adding to today. As in other years, you will see some similarities, but also some new elements, but brought together in a whole new composition. So this was the first year that we developed the trends without Eefke Smit. So some big shoes to fill. I hope we managed, but I will let you collectively be the judge of that after the unveil. We kept the process largely the same, so really open discussion, inviting folks to bring ideas in full generality and really building up the discussion from the bottom up, focused with a lot on the conversation. We were delighted to be able to have the meeting in person at the Stables office in London, which was kindly contributed by Springer Nature. Thank you for that. And what also remained is the generous sponsorship of IEEE, for which we are also super grateful. So some differences compared to the other trends. Even more than other years, we really wanted to include a wide range of perspectives. We invited people from the 3 other STM committees: Open Research, Research Integrity, Social Responsibility. And we invited a number of editors because we felt they are really uniquely placed to connect the perspective of the researcher with that of running an academic journal. And we really tried to focus on a future 5 years from out, so not talk so much about the directionality that we're seeing today, but really imagining what the world is going to look like in 5 years. That led to some really rich, deep discussions, and these notes are a testament to those. If you're a good pattern spotter, you will immediately some of the themes. This is the one that stood out, to no surprise, I'm sure. AI popped up in many places, in many different ways, but if our discussion showed anything, it is that AI is this multi-headed beast that has impact on a lot of different levels, from the operational to the strategic to perhaps the existential. And of course, in both positive, negative ways, bringing risks as well as opportunities. But not all that matters is AI, and AI is not all that matters. Another important thread of our discussions was around veracity, verification, validation, trust, credibility. And thirdly, a set of topics around possible fragmentation of scholarship and the risk of the balkanization of science driven by geopolitical tensions and divergences. So these topics and several others, they were the main threads of inspiration for this year's edition of the STM Trends. So with that, here is the big reveal. Ta-da, there it is, STM Trends 2028, entitled Reimagining the Human Factor, Defining Our Place and Values in the Networked Machine Era. There's a lot to explore, so let me give you a tour. And I'd like to start with the abstract, which states that this year's Trends imagines a future in which AI has become an essential part of the fabric of research and scholarly publishing. We see a blended workforce with humans and machines working together to advance trusted research, building a vast network of knowledge that links articles to research data, experiments to code, authors to institutes, and funders and scholarly works to podcasts. In this future, content is produced and consumed by both humans and machines. Traditional peer review is supplemented by automated checks, and trust is a quality that flows between nodes in the scholarly network. The future, though, is not some technical utopia. Paper mills and pirates attempt to exploit technology for their own gain, and we see fissures appearing in the global scholarly network. And for some, the world has just become too complex, and it's time to go back to basics. So in this hyper-complex system, how do we ensure accountability, transparency, ethics, equity? How do we preserve that human factor? As I already alluded to from the notes, this year's edition of the Trends really follows three main strands: humans and machines, sources of truth and trust, and cohesion. And let me say a few words about those at the theme level before I dive into the details. So humans and machines places AI into a bigger story about the role of technology and human-machine interaction in our sector. This is also why the subtitle says network machines and not just AI, because it's part of that bigger narrative. Really dating back to the print press and the digital transformation that came with the internet, and now another wave of acceleration with generative AI. Will machines take over? Or will creative humans rule smart machines? I believe personally that as a sector, we have only just begun to understand which new interactions and processes between humans and machines will develop. But what does seem clear is that we will be part of this network of humans and machines working together and sometimes against each other to develop the world's knowledge. The second main theme is around sources of truth and trust in this world. How do we know what's real and what's been fabricated? What can be trusted? Who can be trusted? And what are the sources out of which truth and trust derive? The third main thread is around cohesion, or togetherness is a word that we've also toyed around with. And this is fundamentally about connections and their coherence in this highly networked future. This is also where geopolitics, divisions, and perhaps the human condition come in. Fundamentally, at least to my mind, the story this year is about humans. It's about what being human means in this connected, networked, highly technological future. What are the values that we absolutely need to preserve, and which ones might be due for a rethink? How do we think about trust, accountability, transparency, and how do we think about connections, relationships, and a sense of community in a globally connected knowledge world? So zooming into the detail, Act 1, humans and machines. So we imagine that humans and machines will coexist in new ways and with new interactions, and that we are only starting to see the beginning of that. And this is not just about scholarly communication. It starts with the generation of knowledge. It impacts all the traditional functions of academic publishing, registration, validation, dissemination, the archiving, and also affects what happens afterwards, what happens downstream, how research is brought to the general public and to decision makers. So here we see a robot lab. Exciting things are happening there. We have scientific hypotheses that are being generated by AI. Experiments are conducted, results are captured, articles are written, and in some cases, machines will just be very smart assistants. But we also believe that there will be fully operational labs with only very marginal oversight by humans. For publishers and research institutes, funders, and technology providers, this means we should rethink how we see machines and really think about them as colleagues in a blended workforce. Some jobs will be automated away, new jobs will emerge, and the publishing house of the future will be a very different place with different qualities and skill sets that will determine success in the marketplace. And note that, and this is alluding to blockchain and decentralized technology, we have the funder of the future carrying a big purse of Bitcoin. Ongoing discussions on business models. We see that in the picture here. We expect that this will still be a mix in 5 years' time. The majority view holds that OA will be the dominant model in various shapes and forms. But there were also some who predicted a reappraisal of the subscription-based model. Here we see a publisher who is working to make connections between different research outputs, effectively curating the scholarly knowledge graph. We think that this will be an important value add that publishers bring to the table in this networked future. So this new world brings about new forms of communication. We have the traditional human-machine interaction, keyboard, mouse, and I already include touch screen as part of traditional human-machine communication, supplemented by virtual reality and machine-to-machine interactions with new data formats, new APIs and interfaces that are optimized for machine communication rather than humans. Assistive technology, we think that AI could be very valuable and a positive way to develop assistive technology, helping people, for example, with visual impairments, but also offer on-the-fly translations from, say, Chinese to, say, English, or from a highly detailed specialistic journal article to a layman summary or a policy brief. And more generally, we expect that in 5 years' time, a lot of the interaction that people will have with scholarly content will be mediated through an AI. And we'd offer that you should not just think about AI as a specific feature or a specific tool, but really think about the role that AI will play in channels and interfaces. For all practical purposes, our human interactions on the web may become very densely intertwined with machines, and that was one of the sources of inspiration to have that very central picture of the cyborg. We'll speak more about research identity and how that plays a role in trust and quality assurance a bit later on, but for now, we imagine that machine actors will be identifiable, and in order to safeguard transparency and provenance, especially where they are part of the chain of knowledge generation. That calls for persistent identifiers and metadata, and perhaps even ORCIDs for machine authors in the future. Looking at you, Chris. Act 2, sources of truth and trust. And this is where we think about humans and machines collaborating to steward the scholarly record. And we imagine, or we picture that scholarly record as a knowledge graph that grows and develops over time. The graph contains lots of entities. There are various actors and organizations. We have journals, we have publishers, we have institutes, funders, technology providers. And as we will see, these entities have an important role to fulfill to connect the nodes in the graph and to provide trust. And of course, we have a variety of content types, articles, methods, software, and data, lots of data, both streaming and static. And especially the streaming data will call for new ways to think about fixity and think about timestamping. We expect to see new forms of short-form engaging content that leverage AI to translate highly specialist material to a more general audience, YouTube videos, TikToks, podcasts, and so on and so forth. All these entities map to nodes in this network. They carry persistent identifiers to make them findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and they are connected through relations that could either be inferred or self-declared, which means they have relatively low levels of trust. But these relations could also be asserted by trusted authorities, which gives the connection a higher degree of credibility. And these connections carry information about their origin, again, to safeguard transparency and provenance. So how does truth and trust look like in this network metaphor? Let's first talk about quality control. We imagine that this, in essence, will be assisted decision-making. So we imagine that peer review will still remain central in 5 years from now. And so will the fact that a human editor is ultimately responsible for a decision to accept or reject a piece of work. But the peer review system will be much more efficient because it's combined with AI checks for research integrity, for novelty, impact, and also other markers of quality and relevance. And we imagine that this will be brought together into novel, sometimes nonlinear workflows. For some publications, there will be automated updates when new data becomes available, rendering the article a much more fluid, living concept compared to what it is today. So let's look at those sources of trust. I mentioned the word trust already a couple of times. Let's start to zoom in. So with this network becoming increasingly global and increasingly inclusive, we see that sort of the trust that derives from small circles inside baseball that starts to break down. And I would argue that fundamentally that inclusivity is a good thing, but it also means that we need to look at other ways to ascertain trust. And in this networked setting, we think about trust as a quality that flows between the nodes in the network. So trust can come from connections with authoritative sources, for example, a research institute or a funder or a publisher. The example that is shown here is an author who is connected to other researchers, but also to an institute, to funders via the grants they received, and to earlier publications in journals. So for that trust to flow, we need a validated connection, and that's indicated by the tick mark in the picture that, in this example, connects the researcher to an institute. And the fact that a connection is validated is important because it means that there is a trusted source for that connection. That could be a research institute asserting that an individual is part of their staff, but it could be also a publisher asserting that a researcher has published in one of their journals. So with that connection established, some degree of trust can then be assigned to the author stemming from the affiliation in a general sense or from a concrete event, for example, when the researcher is awarded tenure, or if they receive a competitive grant, or if they publish a paper. Now, of course, that notion of trust that is associated with, for example, receiving a very competitive grant from a well-known funder, that's not a new concept. But we think that in 5 years' time, all these processes and the trust that is associated with them will be captured much more explicitly and can be used to evaluate the trustworthiness of people, organizations, and scholarly content. I should note that here we depict trust as a single number that is likely too simplistic, and in reality this would probably be a vector or a matrix or a tensor, some higher dimensional object. Trust can also diminish, for example, an author who is co-authoring with someone who has had many articles retracted with research integrity concerns. And of course, there should always be room for people to contribute without prior trust indicators. Thinking about early career researchers or those outside of the regular academic system who still can have very meaningful contributions to make. To be sure, trust doesn't just apply to individuals, but to all of the elements in this graph, to the various content types, to articles, to data, to YouTube videos, but also to organizations, including publishers. And if we think about trust in this way, this is also where we see the value of brands coming in. Brands can play an important role to signal consistency, the consistency of quality, reliability, and we think that that role that brands play will carry into the future. Moving on to identity. So with content becoming increasingly easy to fabricate, we believe that identity will become a much more central concept in 5 years' time compared to our world today. And identity here consists of two parts. First, there's the proofing, making sure that a digital identity is associated with an actual physical person. And with the attributes, what do we know about the identity that could make us trust that they are a bona fide researcher? And we think this is an area where the publishing sector really has some catching up to do. For example, in financial services, there are elaborate Know Your Customer, KYC programs that give service providers insights into, in essence, the trustworthiness of the people they do business with. Even in consumer service, and this is one of my favorite examples being Dutch, when I want to hire an electric cargo bike, I am not at all surprised. I find it sort of evident that I need to take a picture of my passport and I need to take a selfie. But when I want to submit a manuscript for publication, then usually, in many cases, I can do that with just a throwaway email address. If you think about it, I think this is fundamentally because publishing has, for centuries, been a trust-based system. And I would argue that it should remain that way, but we need to be thinking about trust in more sophisticated ways, and identity is a critical element of that thinking. In the spirit of humans and machines, we might need a Know Your Machine program as well. Moving on to the third act, cohesion. And this is where we look at the forces that pull us apart and the forces that keep us together. So the world that we're imagining 5 years from now is not some technological utopia. We still have paper mills. We have pirates who make clever use of technology to subvert the system for personal gain. Also for them, AI is a superpower for the bad guys who will find new ways to subvert workaround publishing processes and the existing quality checks. We expect to see nonsensical articles making their way into the scholarly record. And that poses a big problem, in particular when they flow into AIs and sort of the fake science get mixed in with actual bona fide research. And that again feeds into the bigger problem of misinformation and disinformation. And also in 5 years' time, trust in science will be under threat. We found it very difficult in our conversations to predict if this problem is going to get larger or smaller compared to today. And that is depicted by this growing error margin in the graph. Big worry for many of us in this light, the rising geopolitical tensions and the prospects and the realities of war. And this is represented by this faded peace sticker somewhere in the background, almost like it's kind of forgotten about, a remnant from the past. So with those tensions, and perhaps as a general manifestation of not only the human factor, but also the human condition, we will see fissures and fractures appear. So what does that mean for scholarship and the scholarly record? In the language of this knowledge graph, it means that we could imagine two possible future states. One that is globally connected with connections all over the place, regardless of geography, nationality, faith, ideology, etc. But we could also see an alternative, a graph with several largely independent islands that are heavily interconnected within themselves, but largely unconnected to other islands. A splinterverse or splinternet is a word that I've learned. So with those geopolitical tensions and these forces of nationalism, ideology driving fragmentation, what are then the sources of cohesion? And I think these are many of the things that we have already spoken about. First of all, of course, the research communities that exist today and how they have shared norms and ethics, but also quality, trust, transparency, accountability, provenance. And brands can play a role here as well as beacons of reliability. For example, journal brands, both the international journals, but also those with a more regional focus. And of course, collaboration. It's imperative that we continue to work together between publishers and also with all stakeholder groups in scholarly communication to collectively drive for that connected, cohesive future. So we spoke about humans and machines, we spoke about trust and truth, we spoke about cohesion. Let's take a step back and really look at this future as a system for scholarly communication and then reflect on its performance parameters. Firstly, we imagine that some of the trade-offs that we are all facing today between volume, quality, impact, they will remain. But we do think that technology advancements will allow us collectively and individually to find new equilibria. For example, leading to significantly shorter publication times without jeopardizing quality. Research integrity, you will recall that this was a very central element of last year's STM trends, and we expect that also in 5 years' time it will remain absolutely critical for us. And in fact, probably even more so. AI can be used to generate fictional research articles, subvert publishing quality checks in clever new ways. And with AI's use to synthesize large corpora of content, pollution of the scholarly record also has profound downstream impacts, also risking the public trust in science. In addition to these metrics, we predict that other metrics will become more prominent in this future world. Connectivity, we already spoke about that in quite some detail, diversity, equity, inclusion, to really make sure everyone can participate in the generation, the dissemination, and the utilization of knowledge. Technology, as always, can both lower and raise the barriers for participation, and having the ability to plug into this knowledge network really becomes essential to be able to participate. Accountability and transparency, which we know can be challenging for some AI models because of their black box nature, but exactly for that reason, all the more important. And finally, velocity. And velocity was a bit the dark horse in some of our discussions. I think it's clear that AI has the potential to really bring step changes in the pace of some of the core processes of scholarly publishing. But we should also think about its impact on the system as a whole. Will exponential technology finally kick in and really accelerate change, possibly disrupt things? And there's an argument to be made that we're in this self-accelerating spiral with technology continuously enabling newer and even more powerful technology, like the internet and cloud infrastructure enabled vast amounts of data to be shared, which in turn could be used to train LLMs. What's going to be the next step in that chain? Or will the oil tanker only change its course ever so slightly? Some technology providers point out that this industry is traditionally slow to adopt, often skeptical about new technology. And there is an argument that the foundations of scholarly publishing, for example, journal brands, have been in place for centuries and will probably remain steady anchors for the foreseeable future. But so if we do hit that accelerator, are we all collectively ready for that? And who will lead the charge? Will that be big tech? Will that be tech-driven innovators who specialize in our sector? Or will that be publishers who either individually or collectively seize the opportunities that are ahead of us? Finally, speaking of velocity and change, there were also voices that raised concern that this is all going to go way too fast and the world will just become way too complex. Even in a world that is so technologically advanced, sometimes simple solutions can still be very effective. And we have a lot of them already in hand, for example, in the space of digital identity. But more fundamentally, we might see a back to basics movement to preserve that human factor and find ourselves again cozily tucked away in a corner reading a proper paper book with a pencil behind the ear. Though maybe that book has been recommended to us with the help of a really good AI-generated recommender. Wrapping up. To summarize, the title of this year's STM Trends edition is Reimagining the Human Factor, Finding Our Place and Values in the Network Machine Era. It consists of three main threads that are, of course, heavily interconnected. We spoke about new ways for humans and machines to work together, how that affects our workplaces, and how our interactions with the scholarly record will become heavily mediated by AI. We spoke about sources of truth and trust in this very technological network knowledge world, about AI complementing human peer review and how we can think about trust as the cement in this scholarly knowledge graph. And we spoke about cohesion or togetherness, about how geopolitical tensions will have an impact on the research enterprise, risking fragmentation, but also how age-old beacons of trust, stability, and cohesion may be able to keep things together and support a truly global, inclusive, trusted research enterprise. Thank you very much. So we invited a couple of people to share their reflections on the trends. Maybe I can invite them to come to the stage. And in the meantime, we'd love to hear from you if this future vision, how that resonates with you, if you think we might already be there or this is never going to happen. So we've opened up a Menti. If you could go to menti.com, type in that code. There's just one question. Do you expect that this future will materialize? Never? Is it already here in 5 years, in 2 years, or in 10 years? And we'd love to get your views while the panel gets seated. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilke. That's always a big reveal. We'll leave the Menti number up for just a little bit of time, and then I want to go back to the infographic so that our speakers and you will have that before you while we do this responder panel. So I'm joined here today on stage by Anita de Voorde, who's VP Research Collaborations at Elsevier. To Anita's left, we have Stephen Hefner, Managing Director of Publications for IEEE. And on Stephen's left, we have Jay Patel, who's Head of Sales for Cactus Communications. So we're a little bit shorter time than we usually have. So I have characterized this as a responder panel and asked each of them to prepare some remarks. We're running a little ahead of where we thought we'd be, thanks to Sarah and Dana and Hilke being concise in their time. So if we do have some time, we will be able to take your questions. But Anita has also asked me to let you know tomorrow in the overview of today's session, there will be some time to reflect on trends and sessions for today. So you will have an opportunity to take part at that time. So we'll kick off, and I didn't want to do extensive introductions because I can just ask each speaker to say a little bit about the role that they play and how it touches upon the trends. I see we'll move through them and we'll see where we are for time. So Anita, take it away.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you, Hilke. I think it's an incredibly rich and amazing document. My role is VP for Research Collaborations at Elsevier. So that's something that I'm very interested in, is as we move forward, how do collaborations function for the future for STM and AI? I actually had three thoughts as I saw this incredibly deep and rich, and I think something that warrants a lot of thought. This report. The first one is we're talking about moving beyond the scholarly record or the scholarly article, and of course we've been talking about that for a while, and yet it changes remarkably little. So I'm really, really intrigued to see if we can come up with some examples of truly novel and innovative ways when we do move beyond the article. How do narrative, persuasion, and evidence strengthen each other while we improve the reproducibility, the research integrity, reusability, and trustworthiness of scholarly communications? And I'm kind of reminded, I actually joined Elsevier in 1988. I was a physics undergrad, and I joined as a publisher in physics. And next door to my office, which I got, was a room where the desk editors sat. And one of our desk editors, Ernest van der Wolk, those of you who worked at Elsevier might recall him, was a very interesting character. And he had a red pencil. And he went through all the articles for Physics Letters B, a very noted journal, and corrected all the equations. So he went through the equations, and if somebody changed a variable between equations, he would note it. And he would say, no, 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 it's not R, it's K. And he would go through and he would say, well, Professor Hofstadter dropped a half here, didn't he now? He would sort of mutter to himself. And so he would actually follow the math along. And these desk editors would check whether the figures were upside down, of whether they were suspiciously high quality looking from a lab that usually didn't produce such good figures. So they really knew their authors. They noted when they got new fountain pens. And I'm just thinking, in our ramping up, in our speeding up, we have lost some of that accuracy. And I don't think it's very good. And I'm hoping that with AI, we can regain some of that. We can start treating mathematics as the first-class object that it should be in research. Not just speaking as a physicist, it is highly important in all fields. I think we can work to, for instance, making sure that we get the right unit of measure on every single variable. Again, I'm speaking as a physicist, but this would truly help science. So I think, in a sense, going back to those basics would be very important if we can utilize AI for that. Two further quick comments, one on trust and truth. I think yesterday was an incredibly important day. And there was a quote by Elaine Westbrooks from Cornell who said, librarians are custodians of truth. And I think we as publishers should be that as well. So we should think about, we have inherited privilege in publishing this, in allowing access to this. We should think about, how do we improve accessibility and equal access? How do we limit our carbon footprint? These technologies are highly, highly energy sucking technologies. So how do we think about that? And how do we improve the planet and equitable access? And my third point, this is speaking a lot about beyond the publication. The publication extends after it's been published. It gets taken up into the public. It gets used in public policy, but also increasingly, as we all know, it gets distrusted. There were people during the time of COVID who did not follow a recommendation precisely because a scientist recommended it. So I think we have a lot more to fear from human stupidity than from artificial intelligence at the moment as a planet. And I think it's very important that we as science publishers support efforts to support researchers and other parties. Another really great point made yesterday was there are lots of parties that we are not speaking to but should speak to, who also want to improve understanding and trust in research. There's a project that Sense About Science is doing, which I think is very valuable, to support researchers to talk about trust in science. Some of my colleagues at the Elsevier Foundation are supporting them. But so in general, if we can increase and improve collaborations with researchers, communities, libraries, and other players, and be creative and look around you to support them to improve trust in science, I think that would be really great, because a rising tide really lifts all boats, and we have a lot of means, motive, and opportunity to help them rise. So thanks. Those are my thoughts.
Thanks. So IEEE is a major sponsor of this activity every year, so we get to put our little logo on the side, and I think I bought my way onto this panel. But what I found remarkable about the image this year, which did capture the conversations very well, I thought they were wide-ranging conversations, as Hilke said. But it drives home, even though there's machines all over the thing, it drives home how science is essentially a human endeavor. And machines can help enable that. They can make it more efficient. They can optimize it, but it can also calcify and stultify the process quite a bit. It can amplify error. It can enshrine bias. It can cause hallucinations and not the good kind. So to me, the most important images there are the knowledge graph, for example, the divide between the cohesion and fragmentation. And what we need to think about when we, in the scholarly publishing world, interact with a different set of stakeholders and enterprises, specifically in technology-oriented ones, that we're very wary of the fact that, and cognizant of the fact that their business models might not align with our incentives. So are they going to use our content not to further truth-seeking and disseminate knowledge, but rather to scholar wash their surveillance economy model? So let's be careful as the machines come in interaction with us that we preserve the human parts and the endeavor that we're actually in.
I really don't know why I'm on this panel, but I'm
You
glad.
didn't buy your way in?
No, I didn't.
Oh.
I offered, but they said no. Your money's not good. But thanks to Heather and Hilke for inviting me. At Cactus, our focus is really on how to best leverage the data, and we have a lot of data already available. I think the issue is that as an industry, we don't use the data as well as we could be. So before Cactus, I consulted for a whole bunch of startups that were working on selling things to people and targeting doctors with pharma ads. And they are really good at harvesting data and utilizing that data to target people. So it's a nice sunny day, it's spring outside. Well, if you have allergies, maybe you want to go to CVS and you want to buy allergy medicine because today's going to be a really high pollen day. But they use data for that sort of targeting. We, as an industry, don't really utilize data as well as we could. And the data is out there, both the text, the graphic, data about authors, data about institutions. But the one thing that really spoke to me about the graphic was the interconnectedness of data and using it for verifying the identity of the author, verifying the identity of the institution, and bringing it all together for trust and truth. And for research integrity purposes. But all I wanted to say was that we have the data. We need to find a way to leverage it. We need to find a way to extract it. And then we need to find a way to build a system that allows all the different organizations to talk with each other seamlessly, very similar to how the consumer space does it when it comes to serving you advertising or telling you should buy this product. Or you're booking a trip. Well, make sure, here's a hotel for you, here's a flight for you. And those uses of AI are already exist in the consumer space. We need to bring that into this space to basically, build trust and truth with what we're publishing and what we're communicating with the public and policymakers.
Great. Everyone did wonderfully keeping to time. It's great when your panel kicks off and people say why they didn't know why they were on the panel. I will assure you this is a carefully selected panel, whether they believe it or not. So because we have a little bit of extra time, I want to, kick off with a question. Stephen, I promised Stephen I wasn't going to ask hard questions, but I think that these are fair questions. Anita, you mentioned, utilizing perhaps some AI tools to recapture accuracy that wonderful, stodgy, old, but brilliant editors used to bring to the table. And I think about how that might change the necessary skills to the different elements of the workflow that we see today. So how are you thinking about, how is Elsevier thinking about, how are the researchers are thinking about trying to incorporate knowledge about new tools as there will be new jobs that come to play?
So are you asking are we looking at new tools, or are these new?
How is it going to
jobs that we
change
could
the
fill?
work?
Oh, yeah.
workforce?
I think as we become more able to integrate knowledge from the scholarly record, right, we're still not doing a fantastic job at that. There are curated research databases, for instance, that do a very good job at pulling information from papers, curating it, and making it accessible to researchers in a way that's really reproducible. But the article is not set up to enable easy machine readability of components that you might want to integrate in such a database. So I think one of the key things will be the understanding that what a scientist does isn't just their work for their narrative, but is contributing to a larger foundation of knowledge. And I think that is a switch that will need to be, that is enabled at the moment that you have a cohesive record that they can then use. So it's a lot of it will be about if they can see that they can actually reuse a protocol, for instance, if they can see that they can compare their own findings to others without having to painfully dig through supplementary information, for instance, which is a real pain, of course. So as these components of the outputs of science, not so much the thinking, not so much the concepts, but the practical measurements that have been done, as they become normalized and utilized, I think we will get a switch and an understanding that a part of publishing is not just writing a paper, it's sharing the underlying data in a way that is easily reproducible and reusable. So I think that's the switch that really needs to be made. How that is made, it can be, I think, jointly by publishers. Funders, of course, can play an incredibly important role. Learned societies and communities of researchers who utilize and manage and curate these resources. I think it will require skills. I think those skills are coming. We spoke not long ago with a biologist who said, I only trust articles if I can run the code. We were like, wait, you're a biologist? You run the code? Yes, of course. I see whether there's a GitHub link. I see how they did their analysis. I download the code and I run it. And then I trust the paper. And so I think within research, the omnipresence of data science is sort of ubiquitous. But the paper and the way that research is shared has absolutely not caught up and not made it accessible to all. So I think that's the switch that needs to happen. Make sense?
Yeah. So I'm a historian originally, and when I started in publishing, which was a little bit later, not that much later than Anita did, I remember the thing we thought we were all going to have to learn HTML. We didn't think we were going to be able to move forward as book acquisitions editor if we didn't have, some capabilities with HTML, and we know that most of us didn't have to do that. There's a lot of programs now where students can study in AI, and I just wonder how you work in a program where the things that you learn are obsolete by the time you've learned them. And I do think it will just become normalized, and you will have biologists who use AI tools and historians who use AI tools and the like. And it's hard for us to kind of imagine, how that's going to filter down. So I appreciate that example. Stephen, IEEE is a membership organization and has a complex, governance structure and the like. I just wonder, are these elements on the radar screen amongst the volunteers, amongst the members? To what degree are they aware? Are they worried? How do those conversations go?
They're very much aware of it because, they are the disciplines we're in, engineering, computer science, and the like, which is actually causes a bit of a disconnect at our organization because because we're a membership organization of computer scientists, they think we're a software company, which we're not. But I think they're deploying them all over the enterprise, not just for the scholarly pursuit, but for engagement of membership, to build community. There's a major initiative to build or pioneer in cognitive digital twin technology, so that individual members can have a digital avatar within our information space, and thereby interact with content sets and other communities and conferences in a bespoke way curate that for the member. I think those are really interesting opportunities to build engagement, to make more relevant information, to curate our collections for them. But it also, as I said before, has the double-edged sword of of creating an artificial lack of serendipity to wall people off into kind of echo chambers of their own making. And this is where we get concerned about that kind of technology at the moment.
And I have a question for Jay, but I want to ask Hilke to come and to get the Menti beater up just again in case anyone missed that. So Jay, Cactus is operating with, I mean, every company these days has to operate with a wide variety of stakeholders, but I'd say that, a lot of the technologies and services that Cactus is providing, it's amplified even more. There's more tools you're integrating, more folks you're talking to from the researcher side to the university side. How do you, make sure, you talked about bringing consumer levels of security or transparency into some of our academic tools. When you're both communicating with stakeholders about the need for that, but then trying to make sure you don't bring any of maybe the consumer tools where people have a distrust, kind of how do you balance that transparency and kind of mission alignment and trust?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I mean, my job is really interesting because I get to work with developers and tell them, hey, let's build this. It's out there. Let's see if we can use the data and build something. And then we do a ton of testing, and we're very transparent with our clients, with our contacts about what systems we're using. So some of the things that we've built, that kind of align with the technology out there is, utilizing it for developing plain language summaries or creating audio versions of documents and stuff. But that all requires us to know exactly what's going on with the systems that we're using. So we need to be familiar with both the input and the output, and also testing the systems in between, the black box that sits in between, and being transparent about it. It's not always going to be right. It's not always going to be accurate. And so we also advocate for having experts, as Anita mentioned, people who know their maths, people who know their formulas, people who know the science, to actually review what's being outputted to make sure that the systems are working well. Because the black box, a lot of people don't know what goes on in between there, in between the input and the output. So it's really important to be transparent about that. We don't know ourselves. The people who develop these systems don't know themselves either. So I think that's why you need humans on both ends to make sure that what you're putting in and what you're getting out is accurate. So I think that's where really the transparency comes in. It's being honest about it. It's that these systems are new, they're imperfect, and we really don't know what they're doing. So we need to check our work.
Very important. One of the changes, those long timers like myself, one of the changes you may have noticed, I'm not sure how many years ago now, that we used to call this the tech trends. And, we got to really nerd out and, geek out on conversations. And then we started to notice that folks were coming with talking about forces that were not just technological, that were systems and operations, and as Hilke mentioned, geopolitics, human interactions. And the decision was made to just go for trends and not tech trends. And that really opened up the variety of conversations that took place on the day, and I think made these infographics, much richer. So I want to make sure we don't lose, those elements to this. We just have maybe a few minutes. Does anyone feel like there's something that might be missing? We do try to check our work, as Jay mentioned, when we go through. I come originally from the book publishing side, so I feel like I question, to what degree this is more in the STEM space on journals, than books. We may have certain characters who are missing, but anyone, just quickly, is there something that you might want to draw attention to, or you can save this for tomorrow as well, but we just had a few minutes I thought I would offer. Yes, Michael.
Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. Just one quick question. Was any part of the conversation looking at what the state of intellectual property and specifically copyright might look like in the next 5 years? That would seem to me to be fundamental in many respects.
I could kick that off, but of course, curious to hear other views as well. We didn't talk about it as much in the brainstorm session. I think it's a really good point. My hypothesis is, I guess, for many people in the room, it was sort of implicit that copyright will be there in 5 years. But in what shape or form, we did not discuss in a lot of detail. It would be a good thread to follow up on, I agree.
Can I comment on that?
Please.
There's a lot of talk about copyright in the scenario of the black box. How do you track the provenance? But copyright is only a commercial concern. I think the equally concerning is facilitating the scientific dialectic, the conversation, so that the originator and the consumer can speak to each other. Now, whether copyright is durable enough law to survive this transformation is a different question about commercial rights, but it is absolutely an imperative that we preserve at least that linkage between where it comes from and where it's going, so that we can keep doing what we're doing and advancing knowledge and seeking truth.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add to that. In the conversation that I was at during the Trends meeting, we did speak of the idea that the interaction of the user with the scientific content in the future may well not be with the article directly. So you may well not get results lists which lead to papers. You will probably get a narrative summary that's created by a tool, a generative language model probably, where you get a summary of a field, or you get a summary of whatever the question is that you asked. And the question is, first of all, who owns that? Who stores it? Can you find it? Can you reference it? There are many questions to be asked about that. The one thing that we did conclude, further to Stephen's point, is that for us as publishers, it's imperative that we develop models of provenance that allow any statement to link back to the publication that it came from, and to enable those provenance links to keep existing if that snippet of text, that narrative that you've generated on the fly there, does start to lead a life of its own, that those provenance connections are maintained.
So Hilke has, sorry, we're out of time, but we're going to have some opportunities tomorrow and certainly during the break. So we see our Mentimeter results. I would like to hear from later on from the people who said never, whether they haven't had their coffee yet, or they're going to try to get the medieval scribe business back up and running. So please do come and talk to us about that. Before we move to our next session, I just want to say, did you notice the T-shirt that Hilke is modeling for us here? You each get a T-shirt. It's like my Oprah moment. Please stop by the table, the registration table, and you will be able to get a T-shirt and a poster. Yep. A T-shirt and a poster to take away. So we can all look like a big motley singing group if we put them on at the end of the day. So I will ask you to thank our panelists one more time, and thank Hilke. And I will ask Roger and Tracy to join us on stage.